What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
Welcome to episode 28 of Reframing the Narrative, and we're super excited to have our guest Ryan back in the house again. Ryan, welcome.
Thanks so much, PJ and Jake. I'm just really excited to be back on with you guys. Actually, this is my third attempt at trying to record a Franklin episode. I've been invited on two other shows to talk Franklin, and then once I sent over the notes, they're like, "We're not talking Franklin." So I'm excited that we can actually talk some Franklin Credit Union scandal without having to hide anything.
Absolutely, and we'll see how the algorithms treat this discussion, but hopefully it stays live and it adds a new flavor to especially what's going on in the world today, which we'll touch on, I think, a little bit later. But Ryan, I think our viewers already know you, but maybe just a super quick background about yourself. And then I know you've spent a lot of time in this rabbit hole. Maybe just tee it up for some of the highlights that you found in looking into the Franklin situation. And I know there's been a couple books written about that. So why don't you take it away?
Yeah, so my name's Ryan Manniti. I actually just got a new job working at a functional health coaching company. We help people radically transform their health. And really got into conspiracies in 2018. The first big rabbit hole that I went down was vaccines and realizing how much of a scam that all was. And it seems to come up pretty regularly with a lot of different people. Like my wife's brother, so my brother-in-law, he's about to have his third child. So now I get to educate him on vaccines, even though like it's kind of contentious, like how is he going to receive it? I have no idea. But I also feel like there's this moral imperative to where God forbid something were to happen to his child because of a vaccine injury, and I could have let him know. I could have been that voice in his ear to be like, "Hey, man, you don't have to do this. There are ways out of it." Especially in Texas. I mean, there's like philosophical. You're allowed to have a philosophical disagreement about it, which in Illinois you're allowed to have no disagreements about it. No religious exemptions, no philosophical exemptions. So in Texas, you have a lot more liberties than you do elsewhere. But yeah, I've been in the conspiracy game for like the last 7 years, so since 2018. And when I first got into conspiracies, it was all podcasts and it was all like BitChute videos and stuff like. But then I was just like, I want to know these topics inside and out. So I ordered a ton of books. I ordered like 20 books, and I was like, well, which one do I read first? Because there's so many, like, there's the Phoenix program, there's the Tavistock Institute, and there's the Franklin scandal, and, 17 others. And I'm just like, which one should I do? But, like, in my heart, I'm just the Franklin scandal. For, like, some reason, I'm like, that's got to be the first one. So I read it. And then I was just instantly, even though, like, we already knew about Epstein, we already knew about McMartin Preschool, all these things that we can get into later on, but still to just read the details and how specifically it was covered up, it's just like so textbook for everything that we see today. And it's like really like, like kind of like what you would think in like a spy novel, like so many tricks and tactics of deception and getting these kids to say falsehoods and bully them into submission, and all of these different tactics that they use are so super illuminating to how the world actually works behind the scenes, and something that the normie populace, like, I don't even know if they could handle the Franklin scandal book, knowing that that's how things actually go down.
It's kind of monstrous. If you are familiar with those particular events and developments, I hate to use the word scandal. I mean, it's just the facts, right? It's a scandal because people aren't prepared to accept that those situations and behaviors exist in our world. So inevitably we're going to end up using the word scandal when we're talking about like the Franklin scandal, because the book was literally called The Franklin Scandal by Nick Bryant. And by the way, the book you're referring to that you read about the Franklin Credit Union centered mostly in Omaha, Nebraska, right? Was that the Nick Bryant or the John DeCamp book, or have you read both?
Yeah, so I've read a little bit of the John DeCamp book, which I think he, from what I've understood from Nick Bryant. Now I haven't read obviously the full John DeCamp book, which is, I think it's called The Franklin Cover Up. And so Nick Bryant is the Franklin scandal, but in the Franklin scandal, Nick Bryant kind of talks about that he thought DeCamp was was a little more far out in terms of the Satanism allegations. Although I would probably disagree with Nick Bryant, and which made me interested to read the John DeCamp account of events, because you read like Shawnita Moore, like even in the Franklin scandal, Shawnita Moore and Paul Bonacci, those are the two kids who primarily talk about the Satan worship angle of this whole thing. You don't really hear that much throughout the story. You hear of a ton of child abuse, which is satanic in of itself. But what you don't really hear is like, a Satan worship angle or a ritual kind of deal going on. And Shawnita Moore explains that in vivid detail in the Franklin scandal. So for Nick Bryant to kind of be like, I don't think Satanism was a big part of this. Well, Paul Bonacci was like one of the call boys that was called to the White House when that whole scandal erupted. If anybody's not familiar, just look up White House call boy scandal. There were literally male prostitutes. They said that they were of age, but there were kids. They were below 18. And Paul Bonacci, it's sickening to say, but he was one of the biggest child prostitutes that there was. And he said, without a doubt, there's the core of this is Satanism. And he's seen a bunch of ritual satanic abuse, and Shawnita Moore's accounts, I mean, they echo exactly Paul Bonacci. People like to write off Paul Bonacci as some like wingnut crazy.
King's partner was Washington lobbyist Craig Spence. Spence took youngsters, including Bonacci, on private midnight tours of the White House.
So you were in the White House then?
Yes.
And how did you gain access?
Well, I came down with Larry King, but Craig Spence was the one that arranged the trip for us. And it was kind of a gift for our services that we were doing.
How many times were you on this kind of a trip?
I came to it on 2 times.
2 times. And were you used for sex on those occasions?
Not until after we left.
After you left the White House?
Yeah.
What time of night?
It was usually around midnight.
Well, maybe we can zoom out a little bit and just give an overview of what the Franklin scandal is and why it's important. Of course, I think it's really important. Like, why would we talk about or tackle this kind of a subject? And why have you been scheduled to be on previous podcasts where you shared your notes with the host? By the way, we haven't seen what your notes are. We're totally on board with your notes, no matter what they say, because we're not afraid. We don't have a big enough audience to be canceled, but maybe we'll find out with this particular podcast. But anyway, maybe we could just back up and get into some of the background, like what era we're talking about with Franklin, and then some of the other things that tie into it, and then how maybe, because you mentioned Paul Bonacci and some of the other victims, how this ties into something known as satanic ritual abuse, which is certainly a thing. And I can absolutely understand why certain authors wouldn't want to go there. And also maybe even some witnesses don't want to talk about it, because I understand Nick Bryant wrote his book about 2010 or so, and I don't think Paul Bonacci was really talking by then. But there is a good resource where you can see him on camera. Speaking of satanic ritual abuse, one thing that they do is create multiple personalities. And so you get with dissociative identity disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul Bonacci, who grew up in the middle of the country, is capable of speaking like 12 different languages, because he has 12 different altars, right? That doesn't just happen when you're hanging out, being a paper boy in the Midwest. So there's a lot of credibility to his story. Not only did he won a civil case, but even the ruling on that says there's plenty of evidence that Lawrence E. King abused and trafficked Paul Bonacci and others. But they ended up, and you can get into it, but how were so many of these victims not only discredited, but they ended up on the other end of lawsuits for defamation and other things that just boggle the mind. So back to you, Ryan, with to get us started and get our 30,000-foot overview on this.
Yeah, and just a brief comment on what happened to the kids. I mean, like, this all culminates in the saddest of stories where the victims are even more victimized and, they are given prison sentences and these kinds of things. Alicia Owen is like one of my personal heroes. The things that she endured, how she refused to kowtow to the CIA and the FBI's demands of her just accepting that she made it all up, and they'll waive her sentence or whatever. She's like, give me the damn sentence. I am not gonna live a lie. And that ultimately, that was her faith in God that that made her so devout in staying in the truth. So yeah, to go over like a little bit of an overview of the situation, just so people know, we're talking about really like late 70s throughout the 80s to like mid 90s kind of thing. And so that might sound like, oh, this must be one of the first. It's like far from one of the first. And, I just mentioned Christianity. You read the Bible, they were sacrificing kids to golden altars long before the Franklin Credit Union. So, this is by far the first. And, we can get into McMartin and some of these other ones that precede Franklin. But we're looking at really like the 80s here. And there was a rising political star. His name was Lawrence E. King Jr. And he was African-American guy. He was just shooting up the political ladder, and nobody really knows where this guy came from. He had like a slight military background, and then he kind of disappeared for the better part of a decade. And people actually have no idea where he was, what he was doing during this decade. So very, very mysterious part of his life. Then all of a sudden he gets into politics when he resurfaces from wherever he was. He resurfaces, he gets into politics and just starts immediately shooting up the ladder. Now, there are some conspiracies and thoughts around what might have happened with Lawrence during that time. Like, was he in some like special military program where they kind of, maybe they MK Ultra'd his ass and then he became this like horrible pedophilic pimp, basically? Or was, was he not MK Ultra'd? Was he just like, like, hey, you're gonna be part of the CIA now. And to be part of the CIA, you gotta, traffic kids. It's like, okay, like, well, which is it? But that's all just conjecture. Something happened in those 10 years where he gets out of that and into politics and immediately becomes a star. He even sung the national anthem at the 1984, I believe, GOP convention. So, like, huge deal. The GOP convention.
Ladies and gentlemen, the chair now recognizes Lawrence King, Jr., a member of the Nebraska delegation, for the singing of the national anthem.
So King, he's this rising political star in the GOP. He's singing at the national anthem, and then he's like just balling out of control. He's like, I'm gonna start a credit union, and so because he's an African American, he starts applying for all of these grants that that the credit union starts getting because of disadvantaged youth and this and that. And what King does is that he starts embezzling all of the money. And, he's like, later on in the book, you learn that he's like paying some of the child prostitutes to stay under wraps, and threatening others who are like saying, I don't care how much you pay me kind of thing. But he's using this money to like pay the child prostitutes. He's using this money to just live an extremely lavish lifestyle. One of the boys that we learn about later in the book, he was actually given a $2,000 mink coat from Lawrence E. King. Um, so yeah, he was just balling out of control, paying off child prostitutes, living a lavish lifestyle of sin and gluttony. He was also a pretty heavy guy, but just like total levels of depravity. So then word gets out that King is embezzling funds, and the Nebraska legislature is just like, we got to look into this. What the hell is going on? How did this completely go under all of our noses? Nobody had an inkling that for years this guy was embezzling money from the government. We need to look into this. So they start the Franklin Committee. And one of the guys, Lawrence Schmidt, he was like the founder of the committee. He was a multi-decade respected politician in Nebraska. Like, very, very respected. I think he was in the Senate for like 20 plus years. And he starts the investigation. And he's a kind of like right-wing figure. So people are like, you could say this is a right-wing hoax. But then actually, I forget the gentleman's names. Oh, it was Senator Ernie Chambers. Senator Ernie Chambers actually gets on the committee, and he's a far left-wing, like pretty much communist. I don't know that he would call himself communist, but he had far left socialistic tendencies. So here we got two opposite ends of the spectrum. A pretty far right-wing guy who's looking into this, and a pretty far left-wing guy who's looking into this. And, just a side note, they both come to the conclusion that there was utter chicanery going down, debauchery, child exploitation. They both come to that conclusion. So if you're like, oh, it's a right-wing conspiracy, or if it's a left-wing conspiracy, nah, they both agreed that it was going on. So I'll kind of stop there in case you guys have some thoughts that you want to talk about.
No, this is great, and I think this is really good background to the whole situation. And you touched on it a little bit, talking about how the one of the victims was put in jail and refused to recant her story. But I know there were a lot of other victims who saw too much and intended to share some of what they found, including there was this guy, Gary Caradori, and he had that mysterious plane wreck where witnesses had said that they'd heard explosions or some loud noise, and the bits were all over the place, not very characteristic of a plane that just had a mechanical failure. But I know there's a lot more, and maybe we can take the conversation that direction as well.
That's obviously like one of the culminating factors, because before they had Gary Caradori, who was one of the most respected private investigators in the country, let alone Nebraska, before they had Gary Caradori, they had another investigator who was kind of like leading the charge. And then he backed down. People were wondering, like, what the hell is going on? Why is this guy stepping down? What's really going on with this committee? Are they ever going to get to the bottom of anything? People are wondering this in town. And so they're like, all right, well, we got to save face. We've got to go with like the best guy that we can absolutely find. Who is that? It's Gary Caradori. So Gary Caradori, they bring him in. This guy immediately, like, he's like a bloodhound. Like, I mean, talk about like, special victims unit kind of detective. Like, just seems like otherworldly. Like, those kinds of detectives don't actually exist. That's this guy. He was a private investigator, and he was just like beating down every door, not sleeping at night, compiling lists of like 300 plus names of potential victims, trying to connect with those victims, get statements, find out more, from those victims, like who allegedly abused you and all of these kinds of things. And so, Gary Caradori actually ends up meeting with a cat named Rusty Nelson. Now, Rusty Nelson was Lawrence E. King's, how should I say this? He was the guy who photographed all of these debaucherous acts. All
His
of these.
blackmail photographer. Yeah.
That's right, blackmail photographer.
Yeah.
So we're again. We're going to talk about Jeffrey Epstein later. What was Jeffrey Epstein doing? It was a total brownstone operation. Get elites. I hate using that term, but for simplicity's sake, get like the parasitic elites in a room with naked children. Either whether the parasitic elite are drugged or not drugged, get them in compromising positions with naked children. We videotape that or photograph it. Now we have this as leverage against them in case they try and ever go out of our control. We can absolutely destroy them. So this game was being run long before Jeffrey Epstein. So back in the 80s, this is what Rusty Nelson and Lawrence E. Keene were doing. And now Rusty Nelson was like a well-known photographer in the area. He's a pretty damn good photographer. Just so happened that, he had some vices. I think it was mainly like drug addiction and stuff like that Lawrence E. Keene could fuel if he just helped him out in these other areas. So Rusty Nelson is taking pictures of kids in sexual positions with people in power in our government. And I should say the highest echelons of power in our government. So Gary Caradore links up with Rusty Nelson. And Rusty Nelson gives him a call and says, I've got the pictures. Because Rusty Nelson, you can imagine, after leaving a crew of like Lawrence and George H.W. Bush and the governor of the governor of Nebraska and the chief of police of Omaha, like those are the kind of cats that Rusty Nelson is photographing with naked children. So they're not going to just like let him live a life, out in the woods in Colorado, which is where he met up with Nick Bryant one time, because he was going to show Nick Bryant these pictures. And then Nick Bryant ends up getting followed down a Colorado hill by police. They pull him over. They tear his car apart without even telling him why they pulled him over. And then they said, all right, you can get back in your car and leave. And he said, what the hell was that all about? And they're like, mister, you're lucky you're alive. That's all I'm going to say. And he just kept on motoring. So that was the author of the Franklin Scandal book. But so now we're talking about Rusty Nelson. He lets Gary Caradore know, again, this super influential, like best in the country kind of private investigator. He lets him know that I've got pictures in Chicago. I've got pictures in Chicago. If you can get there somehow, I can give them to you. Now, Gary Caradore is also a licensed pilot. So what's he do? Well, there's an all-star baseball game going on in Chicago. So it's like, this is a perfect opportunity to bring my son. I'm going to bring my son to Chicago with me. We're going to fly my little Cessna out there. We're going to catch the game. I'm going to get the unequivocal evidence to put these bastards in their place. And then I'm going to come home and I'm going to have a hot meal. I'm going to take a shit and I'm going to go to bed. Like that's the mind of Gary Caradore. I'm thinking like, I fucking got them. I don't even need to guess. Nick Bryant reports on this in the book that Gary Caradore, before he leaves, he calls his wife. He's like, we got them by their chin hairs or the short hairs. It's going down. This is it. It's over for them. So Gary Caradore gets to Chicago, catches the ball game with his son, allegedly gets the pictures, and then on the way back, he's like in the air for 15 minutes or an hour, something like that. He wasn't in the air for very long. His plane explodes in midair, killing him and his son instantly. And when they get to the debris, it was clear that someone had been there before the police had arrived. There were things missing. There were components missing. Now, obviously, the conspiratorial angle of that is that, oh my gosh, they got there after the plane exploded. They collected whatever evidence, pictures, whatever there could have been, because Gary Caradore had a very famous briefcase that he always carried with him. And found at the scene were no pictures, no briefcase. His famous briefcase that he always had wasn't there amongst the stuff, and that was a very big point of contention for Gary Caradori's family. They're like, "Where's his briefcase? Where's his briefcase?" Because it was like a trademark of his. There was no briefcase recovered. Sorry, ma'am, there was no briefcase. And so the closest, they literally had him. They got there. They had everything. Now, they'd already made their case multiple times in court. And it was through, read the book. They had made their case on everything, but there was so much legal chicanery and tricks that had gone on in the court proceedings that I literally had to accept the fact that they had actually constructed the American court system for this kind of purpose, to where the instances, the things that they set up within the system itself are designed to prevent things from going too far, or to stop things dead in their tracks, or like, these rebuttals or grandstands. I forget what you call it, where you can filibuster, where you can just talk for 30 hours in a row, and then they're like, okay, well, I guess we have to go to, this is a dead issue now. Like, how is that even allowed? But so they actually ended up having a grand jury for the Franklin scandal, and the grand jury found that nothing happened. It was all a big hoax by these kids, and the famous quote about grand juries is that I can't remember who said it, some famous judge, and he was asked what his opinions were about grand juries, because there was a sentiment of this at the time. And he said, a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich. Literally, like, all of the evidence was on the side of this Franklin scandal, child exploitation. There's so many things we haven't even gotten into, other levels of depravity, and they were put on display at the grand jury trial. And they literally said, actually, not only did nothing happen, but the kids actually made it up, and we're going to pursue criminal charges against the kids. I mean, it was total lunacy.
Well, not only that, there was the legal side of things, but besides Gary Caradori, there's also Bill Colby, who had a mysterious death as well with the canoe incident. And I don't know if you want to go into that, or other people who were silenced.
That's one of my favorite examples.
Actually, William Colby, otherwise known as Bill, he was CIA director.
That's
and
the
he was
thing.
involved in the Phoenix program, by the way, which is kind of important. And it ties all this stuff together because John DeCamp actually knew Bill Colby in Vietnam. And another important character in all this kind of SRA and child trafficking, this whole world, which he could get really deep into, is so-called Colonel Michael Aquino, right? He was involved with Bill Colby and the Phoenix program in Vietnam. So why don't you take it away, Ryan?
Yeah, so I mean, we could definitely rabbit hole on Michael Aquino and the Temple of Sets, and I always love how his eyebrows are like devil horns. I'm like, how much more obvious does it have to get? And they're like, oh, this guy's okay, he's good to go. No way, dude. I really don't understand it sometimes. But Bill Colby, even though he had levels of depravity with the Phoenix program, he was still unwilling to accept the child exploitation that was going on with Franklin. And so he came out, and he's like, well, shit, I think I'm gonna team up with you guys and like help expose this kind of thing. And then so one night, now this is the official story of what happened to Bill Colby on the night of his death. He was sitting at his dinner table having some dinner, gets up mid-meal, there's a brutal blizzard going on outside. He walks barefooted through a blizzard, through his yard, into his canoe, and then goes sailing down the river in his backyard in a blizzard, and then they find him washed up on a shore miles down the river. And they said that he just froze to death and he shouldn't have been out there in those conditions at his age. I mean, that's another one where it's like, okay, Michael Aquino with the devil horn eyebrows, how does nobody see this? How does anyone believe that Bill Colby actually died that way? stops mid-meal, walks barefooted through a bunch of snow into a canoe. I mean, like, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Maybe he was having a meal with Michael Aquino at the time. It's almost as far-fetched as Gary Webb shooting himself twice in the back of the head,
Right.
right?
Right.
Suicide, official determination, right?
There's these stories that come out, and you're like, you have to be absolutely insane to believe them. But I really feel like it's only us, like the people who are looking for it, and we're just like, oh, come on. But we're like small enough of a subsection to where it's like, okay, well, we can allow them to find out about it. What the fuck are they gonna do? But it's like, don't let the horde, don't let like the 80% or the 90%, whatever the horde is, don't let them find out about it, because then they might start questioning shit. And they're the ones watching CNBC and Fox and CNN and all these things. So they never really hear about it. They're not going to talk about Seth Rich or Gary Webb or anybody else that's a weird suicide on any of those platforms. But you know what? The Omaha residents, they agree with us. Amazingly enough, 80%, 80+% of Omaha residents till this day know for a fact that there was satanic ritual abuse going on in their town. They are unwilling and refuse to accept that nothing happened. So I think that is one of the saving graces of this whole situation, that the entire town, regardless of what the media, there was a full onslaught. The Omaha World Herald, which was the biggest newspaper in town in Omaha, the guy who was the main editor for that newspaper was one of the guys that was renting kids from Lawrence E. King and attending his childhood sex parties. So they were writing hit pieces against the kids, hit pieces against anybody who thought that this was a real thing at all. And somehow, through all of the bullshit, all of the smoke screens that they tried to put up, 80% of Omaha residents still know to this day there was satanic ritual abuse. And so I think that that's kind of a blessing in disguise, or a silver lining of this whole thing. Now, what's happened out of that? This is my argument for why politics doesn't mean a thing at all. Because 80% of the town populace realizes there was satanic ritual abuse. There's probably a satanic ritual abuser as the governor of Nebraska right now. Like, that's my argument for politics ultimately gets us absolutely nowhere.
Absolutely. And, you just summarizing some of those very obvious points where you have to be blind to not see that you're being lied to and gaslighted. It made me think of that cartoon that's made the rounds on the internet of the comfortable lies versus the uncomfortable truths. You've got the table for one and the table for the other, and then everyone's lined up for the comfortable lies, because most people don't actually want to change their worldview in such a way that they realize that there's these monsters controlling things, controlling politics, controlling our power centers. They'd rather just go back into normie land and kind of turn their brains off and, live their day-to-day life. And to be honest, a lot of people aren't wired to even handle some of those truths, to quote Jack Nicholson from whatever dumb movie that was.
A Few Good Men.
A Few Good Men, thank you. A lot of people just don't want to go there. They don't want to go down the rabbit hole, because then it forces them to reevaluate the people that they've idolized as political leaders or captains of industry. When they realize they're corrupted, then they have to completely change their philosophy and how they see the world. And that's a lot for most people to take on.
I had first gotten into conspiracies, so first it was vaccines, and then it was Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm sitting at a Mexican restaurant with one of my best friends, and I'm telling her, I'm like, you've got to believe, like, there's this guy, he's got an island, they're flying out rich and powerful people, they're abusing kids at this island, they're presidents from all over the world, captains of industry. I'm like, the evidence is all here, I can show it all to you. And she's like, even if that were true, I don't want it, I don't give a fuck. I don't want to look at any of it, because if that's true, and there's nothing in this world that I can do to fight back. And at the time, I probably would have agreed with her. Well, shit, what can we actually do? Politics is a dead end game. But, thank God for God, because that really explains everything. As long as you're living a pious life, you're repenting of the things that you've done wrong, the people that you've done wrong, those kinds of things, then life ultimately does have meaning. And St. Paisios, one of the amazing contemporary Orthodox saints of our time, he reposed in the 1990s. But he has a famous, if you search on YouTube, go to the end times St. Paisios, I think the channel is Orthodox Wisdom. He talks about, he's like, the spirit of lukewarmness reigns. Like, men and women, they have no leaven in them anymore. There's no intestinal fortitude. Even people who want to call out the wrongdoers don't, because there's an apathy that nothing will happen and nothing will change. And that's exactly why nothing happens. Exactly why nothing changes is because of the apathy. So I really, again, to bring it back all to God, that really is why we have a leg up on these bastards. No matter if they control the world or do all of these heinous acts, they're going to get theirs eventually. But we have to stay on top of what we're doing to make sure we're calling them out and holding them accountable for these kinds of things, because we're called to by God.
Absolutely. We're supposed to call these things out and to not be associated with them. Those of us who really see what's going on, it's our duty to expose it in some way. And, in part, that's why we're doing this, looking at everything that's thrown at us and reevaluating it and showing it for what it is. But Jake, you stayed silent there for quite some time. What are your thoughts?
Well, one thing that Ryan mentioned was 80% of the people in Omaha that they might know somebody. So they're on board with the accusers, and they're sympathetic, and they're willing to just say those politicians were running this absolutely disgusting, sick game, and the media was in on it, and the courts were in on it. But I know somebody that was abused, or I heard somebody, kids go to play dates, parents go to PTA meetings, they meet in the park. And it reminds me, so Ryan mentioned, the whole vaccine thing. You're not going to hear in the mainstream about people dying suddenly and anybody giving a cause for it. They continue to gaslight over and over and say, these are not the droids you were looking for. But just ask somebody around you, in all honesty, they don't have to live in Omaha. Do they know somebody that had an adverse reaction to Operation Warp Speed injections of the past few years? And inevitably, it's not even like a 6 degrees of separation type thing. I personally know people who know somebody, like a direct family member, and one of my loved ones was definitely affected by it, but I know people who were severely affected by it. And so it just goes to paint this picture of what we're told versus what we hear and what we see. And we just need more. We just need to spread these messages. And I think what I want to emphasize is this is really heavy shit. When you get into this, it's like, okay, our government doesn't love us. The Federal Reserve isn't federal. Every single member of Congress is bought and paid for by all these different forces. Some are having pizza parties, some are having hot dog parties, if you get my drift. They're all compromised. Look what's happening with Gaza, and they're just like, oh, we, bomb Iran. And then, oh, it's all about the hostages. No, they're bombing Syria now, and there's no hostages in Syria. We're just being constantly gaslit, and it can be overwhelming to have this kind of information become clear to you. However, as both of you were just saying, there's God's hand in this, in that we're being shown a lot of as bad as things get, we're being shown the truth of whether it's the nature of our planet, whether it's the nature of government. And I think that's a really encouraging thing. And we might not make it to the promised land where we see justice served in a conventional way. But I think in the end, it will be, because it's it's basically like you can't keep this like a fire. You just can't like hold your hands over it and put it out. It's going to run its course, and we're seeing that now to tie in with current events in the current day. Nick Bryant was just on a podcast with Jay Dyer talking about Epstein current day and how that ties into some of the Franklin issues. And nobody's buying the story. I mean, they handed out fake dossiers, and Trump ran partially on we're going to get to the bottom of Epstein, and now he's like it's a hoax, and nobody wants to be gaslit that obviously blatantly. So there's definitely a backlash, and there's a fissures in MAGA, and we'll see how this plays out. Not that I put any kind of stock in politics on the main stage, because it's just wrestling. But
we don't want to be left with a foreign policy dictated by a foreign country. And we don't want to be left with a system run by blackmailed perverts and financial criminals. And no matter how many times you ask us to stop talking about the Epstein list, it's not going to happen, because we correlate that to exactly what it is we're trying to fix.
Yeah, and I just have to bust you and give a nod to our episode last week that words have meaning. I'm just going to correct you. I believe, Jake, what you meant to say is the nature of our plane. Just wanted to get that on record. And also, too, no, I think this is a perfect segue for us to go into kind of current day events and the Epstein gaslighting. But before we go there,
If
Ryan,
I could put a bow on kind of the Franklin stuff.
yeah, absolutely. Go
Okay.
for it.
All right. So one big point I want to emphasize is if you look at a lot of the victims, Shawnita Moore, Alicia Owen, Paul Bonacci, Danny Keene, and then one of the victims is unfortunately named Troy Boner. So, yeah, his last name is Boner, which there's like this weird thing is like, what's the line between reality and all these things? And then some like deeper conspiratorial level folks will be like, this thing's all an elaborate hoax trying to get us to even screw up our minds further. And Troy Boner, that's an obvious sign that it's a white rabbit kind of thing. I'm just like, oh my gosh, dude, how far does like the rabbit hole go down? I always say that the rabbit hole ends with Jesus Christ. He's at the bottom of the rabbit hole. But yeah, so all of these kids, they have troubled pasts. And that is one of the biggest tactics of child abusers, child rapists, pedophiles. They look for kids who are in disadvantaged youth programs. Like a lot of the kids that were sexually abused were from Boys Town, a local boys orphanage. Where I'm from, there was a thing called Moose Heart. Moose Heart was another kind of like boys orphanage kind of thing. So a lot of these kids are disadvantaged youth. They come from broken homes. And so when they are abused, when they are selected for abuse, they don't necessarily need to be killed, although that does happen in some cases with some of these kids. I mean, like, God forbid, Lord have mercy. But these kids don't necessarily have to be discarded because they're so uncredible from the get-go because of their background. Like Alicia Owen was, she was a drug abuser. She was very promiscuous with other boys her age. And so she was perfect to exploit as like a young 14-year-old because she was promiscuous. She was a drug abuser. She came from, a broken home, just kind of like got into these things that, she started hanging around with the wrong people and then gets introduced to this network, starts going to the network, and then eventually she's totally ensnared in it and can't find a way out. Eventually spills the whole can of beans, which Danny Keene and Troy Boner also corroborated her story. Then Danny Keene and Troy Boner have a secret meeting with the FBI. After this meeting, they come out and say, we made the whole thing up. Nothing ever happened. We were never touched. All the things that we said that happened didn't actually happen. It was all a part of an elaborate money media scheme to make us rich and famous. And it's like, wow, you guys have 9 hours of videotape testimony with Gary Caradori detailing the most gruesome of abuse from all of the politicians that I've already mentioned. The chief of police, Robert Wadman, in Omaha at the time, the governor of Omaha, the president of the United States, George H.W. Bush, Lawrence E. Kane. It goes far, far beyond that. We could, we don't have too much time, and we want to move into contemporary issues, but there's also Henry Vincent. Henry Vincent talks about this this call boy thing that he was running in D.C. And this is how we know about the White House call boy scandal, is mainly because of Henry Vincent, who was running the call boy thing, but he was only using 18 plus talent, if you even want to call it that. He was using 18 plus talent. And then he starts getting calls from high up politicians who are using his service. He's like, who cares, man? Whatever floats your boat. A high level politician can order a gay call boy for me. Who cares? But then these politicians who are ordering the call boys, they're like, well, hey, actually, do you have anything below 18? And they're like, no. Henry Vincent's like, no, I don't have anybody below 18. He's like, well, do you think you could find somebody? And then Henry Vincent's like, dude, what the fuck? Like, I'm going to the police. And they're like, go to the police. They'll fuck you up. And that's exactly what happened. Henry Vincent was indicted on all these things in a grand jury. Again, they use a grand jury to like totally destroy a guy. I think he ended up doing some prison time, and now he's just like living out in West Virginia by himself, like kind of licking his wounds. But the thing is that they use disadvantaged youth because if they come out later, they can discredit their story. But they even took it to such a point. One of the most fascinating aspects of the entire case is Pamela Vucetich, which is kind of like, not a big deal in the Franklin scandal book. But to me, she's a huge deal because Pamela Vucetich initially presents herself to Alicia Owen to be her attorney. Hey, I want to help you out. We're going to take these bastards down. Alicia's like, yes, this is my girl. Signs with Pamela Vucetich. And immediately, Pamela Vucetich is like, all right, we'll take them down. I want you to compile a list of everybody that you know and all of your abusers. And she compiles the list, makes this whole like dossier, gives it to Pamela. Pamela's like, all right, we're going to start cracking skulls. We're going to hit these people up, get them to corroborate your story, and then we're going to take them down. A couple weeks go by. She's like, hey, Pamela, what's going on? She's like, oh, yeah, nobody picked up the phone. And actually, I got to drop the case. I'm just not going to take the case. And she's like, what? We're gonna bring the world down. Fuck everybody up. These guys were all going down. They're all gonna hit the slammer. Nope. Pamela Vucetich, what she did was she compiled all of this evidence, all of these documents from Alicia Owen. She took them, immediately handed them over to the FBI, who she was working for. She was literally an FBI agent disguising herself as a attorney for Alicia Owen, stole all of this evidence, all these documents, all these names, and just took it in. It's locked somewhere in the FBI files if they haven't just burned it, So I thought that was one of the most compelling psychological tricks when you realize that the FBI is willing to have someone masquerade as an attorney, totally infringe on attorney client privileges, all of these kinds of things, and just completely abuse that system.
You literally have to have bricks for brains to take on the FBI in this country, and that's exactly what you have to do this properly. They now, in my opinion, in my investigation, are the architects of the cover-up.
We asked the FBI in Omaha for an interview about its investigation of the Franklin scandal.
Larry Holmquist for the FBI here. We feel it would be inappropriate for us to comment. We work this with the Omaha Police Department. We just don't feel it would be appropriate for us to make comments.
something that, we would think, like, even some of the more conspiratorial people would be like, all right, well, that's a sacred institution kind of thing. No, not so much. That all went up in flames too. And like we already talked about, all of the kids end up getting tried by a grand jury. Alicia Owen and Paul Bonacci get the worst of it. They end up doing some time because of their slander, or whatever the charge was, because they refused to recant. Because of Danny Keene and Troy Boner recanting, they get light slaps on the wrists, no real jail time or anything like that. But then, interesting enough, Troy Boner is terrified by his guilt for years after the grand jury, because Alicia's spending time in prison. Him and Alicia were tight. They dated at one point even. So he ends up recanting everything. He's like, I know no one's going to believe me, but it was actually all true. And I said it was true from the get-go. I should have stepped by my word, but I was influenced by FBI thugs who were literally threatening physical harm against me and my family. And so I recanted everything. But now I'm recanting my recantation. I'm saying everything was true. And then Troy Boner, he ends up dying mysteriously. And then also, like, people's brothers and family members, can't remember whose brother it was. Maybe Alicia Owen. But yeah, I can't remember now. It's been a little while since I read the book cover to cover. But someone's brother, ends up, getting the scoop from their sibling who was abused. And, he's telling the town about all the things that happened, and that's true. And they end up getting him on, like, some petty crime, some petty bullshit. They bring him in, they book him in jail, and then the next morning, he's dead. Suicide, they say. But on the side of his head is a giant gash. But they say he hung himself from the top of the cell. What's the giant gash? Oh, well, he fell because he didn't strain himself up good enough, I guess. And he fell and hit his head on the floor. I'm like, wouldn't his feet hit the floor first? Like, obviously, they just made the whole thing up. They killed that brother because he was a little too loose-lipped.
Aaron Owen. It was Aaron Owen.
Aaron Owen, yeah, it was Alicia's brother. That's right. Yeah, so, I mean, that's really all I wanted to say. What I just thought was the most amazing thing, the most unbelievable thing, was the Pamela Vucetich stuff. I thought that was a cold-blooded, calculated move. And, I wouldn't expect any less, but still, nonetheless, it surprised me.
Yeah, and these things go on today as we've been alluding to, but before I switch gears that direction, and also thank you, Ryan, for that great recap of a case I imagine a lot of our listeners have not heard of before because it's been buried in the memory hole. But, you brought up the instance of Troy Boner, and I have to maybe just give a very quick nod to Jake and I's favorite author, Agent 131711. He wrote a really good article a while back called It's Always a Play on Words, talking about false flag events. And if you really start looking at them, there's some really obvious names that get made up for some of these victims or participants, and they're always somehow related to the false flag event itself. And that's its own rabbit hole. But I just want to bring that up because, yeah, the Troy Boner one was, is that just in our face, so to speak, in some way? But want to throw that out there. But yeah, and over the weekend, I was doing some deep dives in Substacks, and there was a video that had auto-played by this author, Fall of the Cabal. And long story short, there was this interview where they were shown a clip of this woman who supposedly was a witness on Epstein Island, and it was one of those kill switch things where if you're hearing this recording now, I'm dead, someone got to me sort of things. And she was naming the names of a lot of famous people who she witnessed personally on Epstein Island, names like Obama, and that brings us back to politicians. But then there was also Clooney was one that was named. There's some other celebrities who I'm forgetting, but Bill Gates was another one who apparently he and his buddies not only liked abusing the children, but they injected them and did experimentation on them. So these things happen to this day, and whether that story was made up or not, I can't say for sure, but I think it checks out with what we know about a lot of these people. And it's not a left-right thing, as you appropriately called out earlier, Ryan. It's a people in power thing.
I think you're referring to Virginia Giuffre.
That's right. Thank you.
Or Giuffre.
Yes.
Who reportedly has left this plane of existence. It's so hard to tell with these things. And then that kill switch video, I would love to know if that's real.
If you're watching this, it means they got me. My dead man switch activated automatically after I missed 2 scheduled check-ins. I had it set up months ago because I knew this day was coming. I did not die by accident. I was murdered to keep their secrets buried. My name is Virginia Louise Giuffre. I was one of Jeffrey Epstein's victims.
Anything can be fake these days, but it seems to check out. And she was consistent for years in her story, and she was a plaintiff and won a case. Ghislaine Maxwell herself paid off Virginia millions of dollars, and it's kind of, not to get too far astray in her story, but her story could kind of point to some of the pitfalls in being a true teller, because all sorts of people want to surround you and handle you. And the man that she ended up marrying and taking her off to Australia, he was an Australian, or is an Australian. There's lots of indications that he was abusing her. So he might have done that for the money, or he might have been involved, or a little bit of both. To Ryan's point, a lot of these people are very troubled, and they get out of these situations where they're not being abused directly, and they may even win a settlement of $1 million and millions of dollars, and they're not living a good life afterwards, and the process just continues with them. And unfortunately, it appears that Virginia has expired, but there's plenty of evidence linking her to Epstein Island, Prince Andrew, Ghislaine Maxwell, the whole crowd. So that brings us kind of up to present day. If Ryan would like to comment on that.
One thing that I'll say is, one of the conspiracies that I heard when I was coming up in the game, when I was earning my stripes, was the whole frazzle drip thing. Was that they were eventually going to start faking videos. And in 2018, you don't really have the words to put to it. What do you mean fake videos? But now we know them as deep fakes, AI fakes, these kinds of things. They're going to fake videos, and it's going to be so ubiquitous that nobody's going to believe anything that they see on the internet. And then that's when they're going to release Frazzle Drip. And people are going to be so oh, that's totally fake. So many AI at that. There's no way. But it's actually going to be true. And then some of these things are going to be disclosed and nobody's going to believe it. So I wonder if there's still an angle there, or if that's kind of hopium on my part, because obviously I don't want to see the video, but I'd like for there to be some recompense for the acts taken in that video. But yeah, seeing all of the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, when I was working at Live Free Academy, John Bush and we did a podcast, and it was on election day, and we were telling people, what the hell are you thinking? Because there was all of this renewed hope around Trump. Somehow, people who said that they will never vote again, they always come back to it. They always, somehow, they're goaded back into it. Oh, what are we going to do? Have Kamala in the White House? She's a communist. Shut the fuck up, dude. I always thought it was some of the lowest tier, kind of political commentary. What are we going to have that guy? And obviously it is. But, we were telling people, what do you think that's going to change with Trump? He's making a bunch of empty promises like they all do. And then he's going to come in. He's not going to fulfill any of them. Well, to our surprise, he came in. He let out Ross Ulbricht and a couple of other things. People are like, he's for real this time. And now it's coming out with the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. He's like, will you stop talking about Jeffrey Epstein? I don't want to hear about Jeffrey Epstein anymore. He's a low-life guy. I told him that at Mar-a-Lago, and that's the end of it. It's like, bro, no. Isn't there a whole bunch of evidence that he was visiting Trump in Manhattan? So he wasn't going all the way down to Florida, but they both had Manhattan mansions. So I think he was visiting him regularly in Manhattan.
This feels a lot to me like the magician's trick, because it's got us all thinking about a case that I would have to guess 80% of the public knows that Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. It's just too damn obvious. So for them to be bringing this back up and then giving the public videotape with a minute missing and details that don't add up, and then saying there was nothing there, there's no list, all of that, that's the magician doing this with his hand over here while something else is going on in the other hand. And that's really what I want to know. What's really going on behind the scenes, where there's this obvious distraction and essentially a nothing burger. Obviously, it's firing up the base who had trusted in Trump to deliver in his many empty promises. But what's really going on? Why are they waving the shiny corner over here? What's going on the other side of the stage that we really need to know about?
That's a really good point. I always saw when there's a big scandal, for me, I'm always really curious about what's going on in the Middle East when anything is distracting us. And even thinking back to like what was going on when uh, 9/11 happened, there was a big scandal involving a, I think he was still in office at the time, Gary Condit, and Chandra Levy, his assistant, and he had possibly murdered his assistant, and everything's looking at that. And then boom, 9/11 happens, and that goes away. I mean, the guy probably got away with murder of his own, like legislative aide. So right now we see escalation with the U.S. sending offensive missiles to Ukraine. Right, something Trump said, "I'm going to get in office. I'm going to end the war." Like I think even in his inaugural Satanic inaugural speech, he said, "We're going to end the war in Ukraine. This ridiculous war," and it just keeps going. He's the Iran situation, Iran vis-a-vis Israel. That's not really settled. Israel's bombing Syria right now, and so yeah, it's almost as if this Epstein thing and the people that invest in the system are feeling their outrage right now, and people like us and possibly most of our audience not super invested in what's going on this stage, and we can pull back and say what's really going on, what's important, and not be fooled by it. But this moral outrage that's going on, a lot of that might end up falling into the bucket that's just waiting there while all of this flood is coming from the ceiling of outrage uh, against Trump, and go into the America Party, right? The 2028 Elon's going to save us party. He just announced the formation of this new party. So that's something to look out for. And right, like Ryan said, like some people that you thought would never vote again because they were done, they got sucked back in, right? We saw that with Democrats in 2008. Just they believed in the system again when the empty suit that was a little bit coffee colored showed up. It was a new look, and he said all the right things, and then he ended up bombing the same, running the same bombing campaigns and winning the Nobel Peace Prize before he even bombed anybody, and then he proceeded to bomb people. So anyway, that's something I'm always aware of, is where is this emotion, this sentiment going? What is it pouring into? There's always a vessel to receive it. And it's always an interesting thing to observe. And then what else is going on? The magician's trick, the sleight of hand. And for me, I'm seeing that, yeah, there's escalation in Ukraine. We're pissing off Russia again. And who knows where this is going to end. China's encroaching in Taiwan's territorial waters. Yeah. Interesting times as always.
Yeah, I kind of view this from the lens of Orthodox prophecy. And so it's funny because just like a month and a half ago, I had heard about this Orthodox prophecy, and it literally goes like, you will be sipping your coffee. So, like, obviously early in the morning, you will be sipping your coffee when Israel strikes Iran's nuclear capabilities. And that will be the beginning. So, like, the beginning, towards, I know, PJ, you have, I forget the name of the theory. What was it?
Little season.
Little season. So obviously, like, end times in your paradigm already happened, but he's saying like this will be the preceding event. He said this in 2016. This will be the preceding event to the end times, to like the Antichrist emerging, all of these kinds of things. And so I thought it was amazing that he made that comment back in 2016. And then it happened super early in the morning for the Greeks because he was a Greek. And that's, why he was speaking that it was going to happen early in the morning. So it certainly did for them. And, then I think that eventually this is all going to culminate in enough people pissing off Russia. Like they're going to be pushing Russia into a corner. And like a fucking rabid dog is just going to start lunging out. But then Russia's going to win. Like Russia's just going to start beating people like one after another, knocking down dominoes all the way to Israel's doorstep. And then that's when like they erect the third temple and the Antichrist is crowned king by the Jews. But I mean, literally though. But it says in Orthodox prophecy that a lot of Jews will convert to Orthodoxy. Praise God for that. But yeah, so the Jews will crown the Antichrist as their king, and the whole world will get behind him, eventually take the mark of the beast, and then heads will roll for people who don't. And then the people that do take the mark of the beast, they're going to start eating flesh and become like literal zombies. I picture the Will Smith I Am Legend types, that like that's the kind of zombies I think are more realistic. I mean, those ones, they're a little bit too athletic. But I do think that there's going to be like an athletic zombie, like a rabid dog, pretty damn athletic. It can still haul ass. So I don't think that like by becoming a zombie, that has the mark of the beast, that you're going to be all slow and whatever. I think you can still like kick some major ass, and even like more so because you're not feeling pain or like whatever's going on at that point. What do you guys think?
Well, I'll just comment that I do think that there could be some parallel events that mirror what has already happened, and some of that could be largely part of a deception. It's hard to say. I don't know what I don't know, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know how things are going to play out. But I think your larger point about a world war culminating in some sort of event that leads us towards some version of the end, whichever timeline you're on. I think that's pretty logical, and I think that's believable from whatever flavor of eschatology you follow. But that being said, yeah, I think there's definitely a lot more in store, and the Middle East and is not real is definitely a an instigator, and has been an instigator for quite some time, and I'm sure they'll be heavily involved in some way. But yeah, I do like your comment about this drip feed that we might see, or maybe we've already been seeing, that it's going back to what Jake and I talked about last week about the revelation method, that they have to tell you what they're doing or reveal the truth in some way to get themselves off the hook in some cosmic way. And even though they're wrong on that account, that's what they believe in, and that's the ethos that they go by. So yeah, I think that there is a growing awareness amongst a lot of people that we've been lied to, and we'll start seeing various versions of that coming out, and we already have. I think there was an overreach in 2020 when the tyranny was just so in your face, and it shook a lot of people awake, and I think we'll just continue to see a lot of that, and hopefully those people don't fall into a lot of the traps that exist for people waking up. There are a lot of controlled opposition actors out there, and even people who seem like they're on your side. Many of them won't touch subjects like what we've talked about today because it names too many names, and I think it gets a little bit too close to home for people who are funding them. So that's probably part of my parting comment. But Jake, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I would once again caution people to take information not lightly, but don't let it get you down. We've kind of been harping on this idea of being in the world but not of it, in the sense that you, in a Zen-like way, you observe what's going on, but you can't get too attached to it. And so it's important to get this kind of information out, whether we're talking about current events or past events, and just have faith that somehow things will right themselves. And it might not happen during our lifetime, but by bringing things out in the open, it's helping in some way. And we're not offering hopium. We're not offering quick solutions or quick fixes. By saying things like, well, voting doesn't matter, people will inevitably say, well, then, well, who do you vote for? Just that this cog disc shows up, no, I stopped voting. But then you're encouraging the bad guys. A lot of people, they're just looking for direction, what to do and how to proceed. And we're not here to tell them what to do. We're just bringing things to light. And our message isn't to say, the world is so terrible. It can feel that way. And there are plenty of fearmongers who will tell you that and sell you ivermectin at the same time. So we are really here to just encourage everybody to find what resonates with them and to live life true to that and true to your beliefs. And a lot of, I think our audience has some spiritual beliefs. And as PJ is mentioning, the little season theory is definitely resonating with a lot of people these days. And even my lunch break is breaking out some awesome videos on that. But just getting back to the Franklin scandal, I think if we've piqued some interest in that and some other related situations, some other ops, shall we say, I personally would recommend that people go check out the Conspiracy is Silence, which is a BBC produced documentary it got the kibosh, I think a day or maybe even minutes before it was set to air. And you can see on-camera testimony from people like Paul Bonacci, and you can see his personality change, and he goes into altars and such, and you will be convinced that what they were saying was real.
I'll just thank Ryan once again for joining us. This was a great conversation, and we definitely got past the hour mark, but I think it was all good stuff. So thanking our audience for hanging with us this long and hearing us out. There's so much more we could have talked about. So definitely, Ryan, we'll have to talk about a part 3 in the future. But thanks again for your time. Thanks for the insight. And to everyone listening, we'll see you next week.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.